Oh, we just want one at a time. Okay, the word pride does not appear in these verses. However, the concept does. And that's why I wanted to start with these. Twice in Proverbs, as you see there listed in those passages, exactly the same words. Perhaps Solomon had in mind, people really need to realize this. There is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. So it certainly seems that the Lord would want us to be aware of that. Having Solomon repeated, allowing that to be in the book of Proverbs, when we think that we can choose the right way, many times it's going to be the wrong way, and it's going to lead to circumstances that we are not going to be pleased with, circumstances different than what we thought. And so that's emphasized here, even without the word pride, because it is often pride that causes us to do this. The kind of pride we're talking about, in which we put the crown on our heads. We have the power, the authority to make the decision and the ability to make the right one, which we do not, because it only seems right if it's not God's way, if it's our way. And that's what Solomon was talking about. Let's also distinguish different concepts of the word pride, of course. I don't think it takes long to explain this, because I think we all know it. There is a sense of pride in which we want to do things in an excellent way. God is pleased with excellence as we serve Him. He wants us, in the Old Testament, for instance, what did He want? He wanted the sacrifices that were best. He didn't want a blemished lamb. Some of the Old Testament prophets said, why would you give this kind of sacrifice to God? Would you give this to your king and things like that? And so God wants some excellence from us. So there's nothing wrong with taking pride in what we do for the Lord and saying, I gave the Lord my best, because that's what He wanted, recognizing that still where the power, the authority, the glory lays. Okay? So then there's the other kind of pride, which is the kind we're talking about as we talk about pride in Proverbs. And that's where I'm going to stay tonight, unless we get done early and you want to discuss something else about pride. I'm simply going to stay in the book of Proverbs, since that is our text for these few weeks together. And what the book has to say, in fact, I think it pretty well covers what we're going to look at. It covers pretty much the book of Proverbs in what we'll look at. So, two kinds of pride. One word we feel comfortable with, is appropriate for us, living the Christian life with excellence. The other one is a word that, God doesn't like it very much, as we will see. So let's notice here first the sin of pride. And I'm glad Parker's here tonight, because I've got an alliteration, Parker, and I know how you love alliterations. All right? We're all going to have S's here. The sin of pride first. It took some thought to do this, but I wanted to do it. All right. Two different translations here. We'll talk about why they're different in a moment. But first, let's notice the focus upon the sinfulness of pride. A haughty look, a proud heart, and the plowing of the wicked are sin. So, not unlike many proverbs, kind of a combination of things here, and all of those things represent what the speaker is talking about. Here are examples of sin. Pride, as we're speaking of it, that is, in which we put ourselves in the place of God in making decisions and choosing what we think is the right way, is like the haughty look, proud heart, the plowing of the wicked. All three of those are sin. We'll come back to the plowing of the wicked in just a moment. Now, the ESV, the English Standard Version, haughty eyes and a proud heart. Okay, so far, about the same, right? Not much difference in translation, but the lamp of the wicked are sin. Those three things. So notice a great difference there, and I think it's worth noting this as you read translations. You need to appreciate why sometimes there's a little bit of difference there. And without going into a lesson on Hebrew, since we're giving Paul a break, he's not here tonight, but we're talking about two Hebrew words. one of which means tillage, that is plowing, and the other one which means lamp or light, something that gives light. And the difference is, well, as we write the words in English, it's like N-I-R versus N-E-R. But when you look at the little Hebrew letters, it's the difference in a point, okay? A little dot. And different manuscripts of Old Testament scriptures don't agree totally on that. So that's why we have the translations, such as the King James, New King James, based on certain manuscripts, and they think it's the word plowing or tillage. And then the other, like the ESV, some of the other newer translations, it's a lamp. Now, the good thing is this. Either way you look at it, we still come up with sin, right? We can understand what the wise man was saying. For instance, haughty look, proud heart, and the plowing of the wicked are sin. Well, the first two we know are something that are sin. God is displeased with. He's stating there. And the third, what about the plowing of the wicked? Well, a couple of suggestions have been made there. One suggestion is that it referred to the labor of the wicked. And the labor of the wicked is just sort of metaphorically thought of, well, whatever he's laboring for, it's sinful. You know, there's no good about the way the wicked labors. That's what makes him wicked. The other idea is, in the plowing or the tillage, thinking about the harvest of that, what the harvest is going to be when it comes out, and that's going to be sin as well, because obviously the wicked don't plant a very good seed. They plant the wrong kind of seed, and that seed results in there being a harvest of destruction. If you'll excuse me just a moment, we're going to cool it off in here just a little bit. I see several people doing like this, and if I had a free hand, I'd be doing like this. So let's touch that just a little bit there. Don't tell anybody I can do that, please. Okay. Okay, now the word for lamp. That makes sense too, right? The lamp of the wicked. The lamp of the wicked would be something that either provides the needed light for the wicked to do wickedness, okay? Or it's a kind of light that says, you know, here's the wicked, you can see me, follow me. You know, you can't see somebody without light or without a lamp. So it can be understood a number of ways, all of which make total sense. They go right along with a haughty look and a proud heart. They go right along with pride, and they're expressed as sin. Now, continuing our alliteration of pride, secondly, pride in Proverbs brings out to us the sight of pride. And we're going to go back to that same verse and make a little bit different point here about it, not necessarily looking at the translation differences. A haughty look, a proud heart. Now, what is a haughty look? Okay, it's not saying a haughty look as in my ability to have vision and see you. I look at you. It means an appearance, a haughty appearance. Now, how do we generally envision someone who is proud or haughty in an improper way? What's their look? I'm speaking, I've lost the word for it, but how do we expect them to look? Okay, let me throw it at you this way. Say, you're not used to talking in the auditorium class. What do we mean when we say someone's got their nose in the air? What do we mean? Feel free to talk if you want to. Proud, right? And we picture somebody going around like this, you know, so they kind of look down at everybody else. Okay, that's the look, the appearance that goes right along with the attitude and the behavior and the other qualities that we'll see in just a moment. Now, okay.
You gotta watch that when you say that about an older person, because they might just be trying to focus their life over.
Okay, in case you couldn't hear that, and if you were watching online and didn't hear that, Dennis said you got to be careful and not make assumptions too quickly. It could be someone with bifocals, and they're trying to see, you know, or even trifocals. They're even trickier, I think. So that look can be misinterpreted, but it's so much somehow an aspect of pride that we have that saying, don't we? Going around with your nose in the air. And you knew exactly what I meant when I said that. So some people look that way, and some people don't look that way as far as the physical appearance. But it has a look about it. There is a sight sometimes associated with pride. And there are other features that we could think about. Now, secondly, here is one of a couple of the most well-known sections of Proverbs that discusses the word pride. There's another we'll look at in just a moment. This is probably, I don't know which one would be first and second. If you ask for a scripture on pride that came from Proverbs, you might think of this one. It takes a little longer to quote it than the other one. But these 6 things the Lord hates. Okay, now what do we know about something the Lord hates? It's something that we want to avoid. It's something that we want to encourage others to avoid, right? Yes, 7 are an abomination to him. A proud look. And then, of course, like we do with passages sometimes, we say, okay, what is this phrase? What accompanies it? What goes along with that in a list when there's a list of qualities, whether they be good or bad? Well, a proud look, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked plans, feet that are swift in running to evil, a false witness who speaks lies, and one who sows discord among brethren. So all 6 of those other things we say, oh yeah, no wonder. That would be such an abomination before God. Those are so wrong. Well, likewise also is pride. And again here, as we think about the sight of pride, as we see perhaps physical features that suggest it to us, we think about a prideful look or a prideful appearance, which may take physical form. It may take physical form in the way of actions rather than the nose being up in the air. And then one more, there is a generation, oh, how lofty are their eyes, and their eyelids are lifted up. Now, does that mean that they're seeing well? Or does that mean that generation is pretty well equivalent to that nose in the air appearance, right? It's like my head is up here. In human interactions, a head up like this suggests, unless you've got bifocals, suggests pride. However, a bowed head, what does it suggest? When someone bows their head, when someone lowers their eyes, all the way back to the ancient Near East. That's the way customs were. To put your head down, to avert your eyes, even to get down on the ground before someone. You show humility. You show you're honoring them. Whereas pride, as we're talking about it in Proverbs, is the opposite of that. It's keeping your head up, your chin up, giving the appearance that I am higher in a metaphorical sense. So the wise man speaks of a whole generation like that. And by the way, I've got the wrong scripture there. I don't have it in front of me, but I forgot to change it. See, that's a danger with cut and paste on PowerPoints. And sometimes you forget to change that. If anybody comes up with that later on, you can tell me and I'll correct that. But don't do it right now. Stay with me. Okay, so the sin of pride. Secondly, the sight of pride. But we don't stop there. There's also the sound of pride. And I would think that probably this is the one that we would notice most because it involves that organ of our body that James warns us about, right? How the tongue, the mouth gets out of control. And how it's like a raging fire. And it has power to control. It has power to destroy. It's something that we will continually, constantly be trying to control in our lives. And it can be very much abused with this quality of pride that we're talking about. The fear of the Lord is to hate evil, pride and arrogance and the evil way and the perverse mouth I hate. So all of these qualities here all as contrasted with the fear of the Lord. Pride, arrogance, the evil way, the perverse mouth. And of course, all of those things go together. The speech that says, I don't need to listen to the Lord, or I know better than the Lord. And whether those words are actually spoken, the results of that decision will result in words actually spoken. And you listen to those words and you say, that's a perverse mouth. The Lord hates that. It indicates pride and arrogance, an evil way. It suggests someone who is seeking to determine their own life, choices, and destiny. They're in charge of everything, master of their own ship. So there is a perhaps even more common, as we recognize someone who has a problem with pride, even more so than physical is, and seeing things, is hearing things, what the mouth said. Proverbs 14 and verse 3, "And the mouth of a fool is the rod of pride, but the lips of the wise will preserve him." And of course, that's a Hebrew parallelism there. You know, the first line says something, the other line says, but this is the other way. You know, they're antithetical to each other. They're the opposite. Here's what happens with the mouth of a fool. Here's what happens with the lips or the mouth of a wise person. Preservation versus a rod of pride. Now, what would we associate in the Bible almost always when we hear about a rod? What's most likely? Yep, beaten, right? Paul was beaten with those rods, wasn't he? And that's the most common. Now, there is such thing as rods suggesting measurements, but most often we read that word, we think about punishment taking place. So we notice what happens here. In the mouth of the fool, it's his own punishment because of pride. He's literally beating himself up. You know, we tell people, don't beat yourself up over this. Well, the fool, because of his words, his mouth, his lips that aren't controlled, because they're overcome, they're led by pride, then that's going to be his own punishment, the rod of pride. He's going to be damaging himself, punishing himself, just as surely as if he were able to, in some way, take the rods and beat himself with them. Okay? And now when we think about this is a little bit different twist on the idea of the mouth and pride. A proud and haughty man, scoffer is his name. He acts with arrogant pride. Now, why do I talk about the mouth being involved here? Is because the prideful man, the proud and haughty man, the one who's recognized as that, people recognize that. And you can kind of imagine here as Solomon writes down this proverb, somebody over the side looking at him, they know him well. It's a scoffer. Scoffer. Now, what is a scoffer? You talk. What is a scoffer? Disregards things. Okay, disregards something. In particular, in a spiritual sense, disregards God, disregards God's guidance, God's commands. He scoffs at them. He treats them as not important, not serious in his life. And that is a prideful man. So we see him not being recognized so much by what comes out of his mouth, but what comes out of other people's mouth. Instead of saying, you know, hey, Bill George or Ringo, scoffer, come here. Because everybody knows he's a scoffer. So, again, pride in Proverbs comes to us by way of the sound of pride. Now, continuing with the negative part, the tragic part, the end game, although we're not to the end yet, the shame of pride, and what pride brings as far as the opposite of honor, which is a word we'll see in just a moment. When pride cometh, then cometh shame, but with the lowly is wisdom. Now, This is one of those proverbs that at first someone, especially someone in the world, might say, no, wait a minute. Why do we think of the lowly as wise? Well, we think of the lowly as wise, it seems to me, first and foremost, because the lowly is lowly enough, is humble enough to say, man, I want to know what God says. I want to know what his will is. That's the only way in the world I can get through life with any sort of success is by seeking after God's way, which means I'm seeking after the wisdom that comes from God. Now, when pride cometh, then cometh shame. Then cometh results that bring about the opposite of honor. Sometimes when we talk about pride, at least these that I've noticed in our lesson, we can find pairs of words to contrast and help us understand. Shame as opposed to honor. That's coming up in another verse in a moment. The lowly who becomes wise because he's seeking after God, God is going to honor him. He may or may not be honored in this life. We realize that. God's not told us that because we live right, everybody's going to honor us. Think about Noah, right? The only honor he got for obeying God and for being serious about God even before the flood was predicted was from his family, no doubt. Because the whole world didn't listen to him. He preached righteousness and they didn't listen. Okay, where was I going with that? Oh yeah, but honor or shame. Okay, the lowly will get honor from God eventually. We will be recognized by God. We'll hear, well done, good and faithful servant. Okay, the opposite of that is shame. When pride comes, if pride is characteristic of us, then we're talking about receiving shame. And again, in this life, it may not come in full force, right? Because God doesn't settle all accounts in this life. All accounts will be settled once a person leaves this life. But generally speaking, and that's what Proverbs are about, right? Generally speaking, even in this life at some point, the one who is overcome with pride, it's going to bring shame in their lives. It's going to catch up with them. That's just the natural way of things most of the time. Okay? Here's what happens to the proud versus, again, the lowly or the humble. Jehovah will root up the house of the proud, but he will establish the border of the widow. So again, we have two phrases with opposite applications there. In one case, the proud, the one who disregards God, who rejects God, who says, I can control my own destiny. Well, all he has to look forward to is the shame of having his house uprooted. Nothing good is going to come to him as far as what he receives from God. But here's what God will do to the lowly, to the widow. And remember, when you wanted to talk about someone who was lowly and enforced humility back then, you didn't have a lot of choice. You're talking about a widow, right? A much different picture you would draw than a widow today, at least in our culture, in our society. They were so dependent. And that, of course, is a big part of humility and lowliness, is being dependent, in this case, dependent upon God. So this faithful widow, the border, that's referring to property, to territory. You know, her border is established. You know, God will seek to watch out after her, as opposed to the house of the proud is just going to come down. Just as sure as God dug around that foundation with his giant divine shovel, and the walls come tumbling down. Okay, so the shame of pride. And now here is the second verse that I thought is one of the two that you probably would remember. If somebody said, can you tell us what verse in Proverbs talks about pride? Probably you've heard this before. Probably familiar. If you've heard many sermons, you've probably heard it a lot of times. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. And we might as well read the counterpart there. Better to be of a humble spirit with the lowly than to divide the spoil with the proud. So the best thing to do is not to associate with them, But most certainly, there are consequences. There is shame. There is destruction, and there is a fall. Now, the word fall there doesn't take a whole lot of Hebrew study to understand. It's just basically like we mean a fall, to stumble, to trip up, just like we think the word would mean. The word destruction there carries with it the idea of being demolished beyond the point of repair. That's where pride can lead us. It can lead us somewhere that we are so damaged, so hurt by the results of it, that we just can't be built back up. We can't go back to where we were. Things are destroyed. Things are demolished. Things are taken away from us that cannot be recovered. So, a very powerful warning about the results of pride, the results of which are shame. It may not be a physical shame. It may be, and often is, a shame of a mental and emotional sense, and where we find that shame. But before pride, before destruction, often preceded by pride. Before a fall, often preceded by haughtiness, which is, very close to pride. You could, make a point of distinguishing them a little bit if you wanted to, but basically we're talking about the same attitude, I think we realize. Okay, a man's pride will bring him low, but the humble in spirit will retain honor. And there's the pair of words, again, that I suggested: pride, shame, and honor. Man's pride will bring him low. Low is where he didn't want to be, right? The person who is overwhelmed with pride wants to be up and wants to look down at everybody else with the perception that he's higher, he is on top in some way, in some aspect of living. But the humble in spirit, they'll retain honor, even though they begin or they live in a state of lowliness or humility. And I couldn't help but think about when Jesus said, the first shall be last and the last first. If you want to be greatest, be the best servant. And Solomon hit on that idea, way back here, centuries before that. The shame of pride. But finally, well, not finally, but almost finally, we want to talk about the strife of pride. And I think we can separate these a little bit from shame, because the others are thinking about shame in a particular sense. Strife, I'm thinking about interactions with people and things. And the wise man talks about that. By pride comes nothing but strife, but with the well-advised is wisdom. So with pride, you're going to have negative conflicts with other people. You're going to have disagreements. You're going to have troubles, all sorts of things that comes by pride. And if we have time in a moment, I'm going to read a quote and a little bit about that quote in which a secular writer talks about it, I think is helpful. But that's the kind of life that it brings to us. We think pride, living in pride, we think, well, everything's going to be okay. But in fact, it brings strife. He who is a proud heart stirs up strife, but he who trusts in the Lord will be prospered. And again, that says pretty much what the verse before it did. Pride brings conflict in our lives with other people, because basically when other people recognize pride, even if they've got a problem with pride themselves, they don't appreciate it. Pride is something that is pretty well universally, once it's recognized, it may be okay for me, but it's not okay for you. I don't want to be around you. But he who trusts the Lord will be prospered, as opposed to strife. Everyone proud of heart is an abomination to the Lord. Though they join forces, none will go unpunished. So there Solomon thinks about, okay, here we got a bunch of prideful people, and they think, hey, we'll form a team. Now, the thing is, a team of prideful people doesn't work very well, but let's say they did. They joined forces, and that's still not going to be successful because that's an abomination to the Lord. And you can gather together, and there's strength in fellowship, right? If it's fellowship in the Lord. But there's no strength in the fellowship of the prideful. Okay, the solution to pride, and just have a verse or two here. The solution to pride, again, doesn't contain the word pride, but it contains, I think, the counterpart to it, the opposite, you might say. The fear of the Lord is the instruction of wisdom, and before honor is humility. So there is the answer to pride right there. There's the answer to pride. The solution to it is seeking for humility, which will come to us if we properly understand the instruction of wisdom. That's the instruction that God gives us, which will lead us into a fear of the Lord, not a terror of the Lord, but an honorable respect for the Lord. And in the process having wisdom, and the process being honored because of our humility and saying, I depend on the Lord. One thing I meant to say at the beginning, and that is, when we talk about pride, I found some writings, some comments about the fact that pride is at the heart of everything that's evil. Well, the way I understand it, the way I don't know where I read this first time in my life, but if you say, what is the source of all sin? What's the source of every sin when you get down to the root? Some would say pride. I would say there's a word that goes hand in hand with that when we talk about the root of all sin, and that is selfishness. And I think you really can't separate that pair of words, pride and selfishness. Selfishness can cause any sin that you can think about. It can be right at the heart of it. And right along with that is pride, because pride tells you, go with your selfishness. Go with what you want to do. You are in charge. You don't have to worry about what the Lord wants. Okay? C.S. Lewis. Back up before you read that. You probably have heard of C.S. Lewis before. Maybe not everybody knows him. You've probably heard of the Chronicles of Narnia, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. But he also wrote a number of spiritually reflective things. C.S. Lewis lived mostly in the previous century. In fact, he died November 22nd, 1963. And you know why his death didn't get a lot of attention in the news? What happened November 22nd, 1963? Kennedy was assassinated. And his death was overshadowed because he wrote some really good stuff. He wrote Mere Christianity. He wrote the Screw Tape Letters. He did a lot of writing in defending Christianity. Now, he wasn't a Christian in the same way that we would use the word. He was a member of the Church of England. But what happened was, until he was about 30, he was a devout atheist. And he had some contact with people who studied with him and talked with him. And he eventually began to be not an atheist, and then he finally became a member of the Church of England. There's some really interesting writing after that, things besides just The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, which even in fact, when you read the Chronicles of Narnia, you get spiritual overtones throughout that too. But he wrote in chapter 8 of Mere Christianity a number of things about pride. And I thought this was a really good statement about it, something maybe that we would, burn into our minds and think about. Pride is spiritual cancer. It eats up the very possibility of love, contentment, or even common sense. And I thought that was kind of a vivid image right there. You look at pride, you don't just see a word on a page, hopefully. You see the results of it. You see what it really means. It's like cancer, and it prevents us from enjoying lots of other things. You see a person who is consumed with pride, they're not going to be a person who has joy in the biblical sense. Okay, it's just impossible. Just impossible to do that. Now, I wanted to read a couple of other quotes that C.S. Lewis had here because I think they kind of bring out some of this. Okay, he says, I now come to the part of Christian morals where they differ most sharply from all other morals, and that is the vice of which no man in the world is free. Remember, I started off with that point. We all have to be aware that we have to deal with pride. It's just so easy. Which everyone in the world loathes when he sees it in someone else, and of which hardly any people except Christians ever imagine that they themselves are guilty of. I've heard of people admit that they were bad-tempered, or they cannot keep their hands off this or that, or even if they are cowards. I do not think I've ever heard anyone who was not a Christian accuse himself of this vice, speaking of pride. Okay? And at the same time, I've very seldom met anyone who was not a Christian who showed the slightest mercy in it to others. There's no fault which makes a man more unpopular, and no fault which we are more unconscious of in ourselves. And the more we have it ourselves, the more we dislike it in others. We're going to run out of time in a minute, so let's see. Yeah, here we go. This is about anti-teamwork right here. That's what I would call it. The Christians are right. It is pride which has been the chief cause of misery in every nation and every family since the world began. Other vices may sometimes bring people together. You may find good fellowship and jokes and friendliness among drunken people or unchaste people. But pride always means enmity. It is enmity. And not only enmity between man and man, but enmity to God. So that's how much of an abomination pride is. That you have a bunch of people who you could identify as, here we've got 10 people, the most prideful people in the world because of the way that they live, the way that they think, the way that they make decisions. You bring them together, and what's going to happen? Enmity. That's the nature of pride. The nature of pride. Now, we've only got 1 minute left. I thought maybe we might have some time to talk about examples, but we aren't, okay? I would encourage you, if you want to do something when you get home, just sit down without opening up your concordance if you want to. If you want to, go ahead. But just sit down and write out a list of Bible characters that come to mind just like that and say they had a trouble with pride. And I'll tell you, you can start with Eve, right? You can start with Eve, back to the very first, because the serpent said, "Oh, God knew that wasn't the case. God just didn't want you to be like him." And Eve said, "I want to be like him." And when she saw that fruit and she saw all the features that Satan had suggested, she said, "I can make a better decision than God." So, do that. Go through Scripture when you get some time and think about all the people that had this problem of pride. And use your concordance and go through these in Proverbs if you'd like to. Thank you for your attention. And I would thank you for your participation, but I didn't let you much, so thank you anyway.